again is called Buffalo Country, and we are very pleased and happy to have Sean Beckett join us. Sean has been working for the North Branch Nature Center for the last 3 years, but prior to that, spent a lot of time as a wildlife guide out in the West. He has led photography expeditions in Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks for about a decade, with both natural habitat adventures and the World Wildlife Fund. At North Branch here in Vermont, he is the director of natural history programming. He said in his information that his happy place lies somewhere in the intersection of large animals, beautiful photographs, and shared experiences with fellow nature lovers. So here we are, nature lovers, and we are ready for a wonderful presentation. So take it away, Sean.
Well, thanks very much, Tom and Clem and Jacob and Jeff and everybody at Green Mountain Audubon. I really love hanging out with all of you, whether it's in person or virtual, as the case may be. But I love coming up with new talks and new ideas and new things to share. As Tom mentioned, I wear a bunch of different hats. My primary hat is with North Branch Nature Center, but I also guide wildlife expeditions with Natural Habitat Adventures World Wildlife Fund. And so most of the photographs that we're gonna see tonight are taken on safari during trips that I'm leading. And I guess I might as well just make one shameless plug, saying that if you're interested in coming out to this landscape with me, we're going to be doing a Nature Center hosted trip out to Yellowstone way out in June 2022. So yeah, put that on your buy a 2022 calendar and then put that on it. Let's see, I usually have I'll say just one quick housekeeping thing up front is that because of my setup here, I know I'm not looking directly at you, and so I just apologize. You can pretend that I'm looking at you even though I'm looking off to the side at my monitors over here. So apologies for that up front. And then the other thing I just have to declare up front is that usually when I get to talk about really anything having to do with wildlife ecology, I have the benefit of being with somebody for 7 or 8 days in the field to do it. And whether we're talking about grizzly bears or wolves or bison or whatever, they're nuanced conversations, and there's a lot of complexity there. And that complexity is really hard to disentangle in the span of an hour. And so in putting together this talk, and running through it the first time, I realized, oh, I'm at like 3.5 hours. I better find something to cut out of here. And so I'm just going to recognize that, we could make this a entire, college course on bison, but I thought it would be more fun to just take you on a tour and share with you what we might come across if we follow bison through the landscape. And so the first thing we're going to do is just get you settled into place. We're going to be paying attention to this area up here in Northwest Wyoming and Southwest Montana. This area here is called the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, this big box that I'm drawing over the map. And this is where I spend most of my time guiding, and where the bison herd in question that we're going to be talking about really spends its time. Now, if you pick up this box and you dragged it over towards Vermont, you'd find that this box is about 18 million acres in size. It covers and then some all of Vermont, all of New Hampshire, and pretty much all of Massachusetts as well. And so we're talking about a really big region. It's the largest intact land in the lower 48. And in that land is essentially every species that Lewis and Clark would have seen had they wandered through there back in 1803 to 1806. And that's the only place in the lower 48 where we can say that. So zooming in now a little bit on the northwest corner of Wyoming, here we have Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks. I'm draping over the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem over this so you can see. Those black outlines are Yellowstone National Park, Grand Teton National Park. But surrounding those two national parks are another 14 million acres of national forests and Native American reservations and Bureau of Land Management land and national wildlife refuges and all sorts of federally protected land, state protected land, tribal lands, and private lands as well. So that's where we're going to be spending our time. And particularly, we're interested in this area up here in the northwest corner, right along the north edge of the boundary of Yellowstone National Park. If there was an epicenter for bison controversy, it would be right here along this line. And so we'll start the talk at this 30,000 foot view, but we're going to end tonight really looking at, really standing on that exact line. And just to paint a picture of what things look like, this is the landscape out there that we're talking about. When a bison is moving across this landscape, this is kind of an example of a little bit of everything. There's mountains, there's rolling hills, there's grasslands, there's sagebrush, there's shortgrass prairie, there's sagebrush steppe, there's you know, all sorts of, there's a diversity of conifer trees, aspens, cottonwoods, but this is kind of the landscape that we're looking at. And so tonight we're going to kind of split this into two parts. Originally there's going to be 4 parts. There's not nearly enough time for 4 parts. We're going to do 2 parts. Then maybe next year we'll do the other 2 parts. How about that? But for tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to spend the first half talking about the biology and ecology of bison. So what does it mean to be a bison? What do they do? What's a year in the life of a bison look like? So we'll go on safari to follow bison around. And then part 2 is about the war on grass, or the war about grass, and the controversy that bison have found themselves embroiled into. And before I jump into part 1, I want to plant a seed about part 2, so you can be thinking about this in the back of your mind as we're following around the bison's biology and ecology. And that is this last photo that I just showed. This is you know, bison ranch land. But right on the other side of the mountains in the distance of that photograph is this, still within the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And this is ranch land. So imagine you are a grazing animal, a bison, an elk, bighorn sheep, pronghorn, deer, whatever. And you are looking for places to go to live out your life in a healthy, you know, in a healthy way. The things that you're looking for to survive are very predictable. You know, you can boil down everything in the movement and migration of our large animals, and birds too for that matter, into a simple equation of these animals have to take in as many or more calories than they expend. And so if you are looking for places to go, you need to move your location throughout the year to find a place where you can access high quality forage and not get killed or eaten or not die from exposure or whatever. So if you're a grazing animal, you're looking for good quality forage. You're looking for good soil quality. You're looking for places that have good soil nutrients, because good nutritious soil gives way to productive grasses. You're looking for places that are climatically more mild than their surroundings, so maybe lower elevation areas that get less snow, that don't get as cold. You're looking for areas that have more water, either through more kind of watershed features and streams and tributaries and that sort of thing, or just areas that get more rainfall in the spring, right? So these are all features that grazing animals predictably want. And you could find those places on the landscape and bet that those are the historic summering and wintering ranges of these herds. Now, imagine you're a rancher and you're looking for a place to start up a cattle ranch. What sorts of conditions are you looking for? And the answer is the exact same things. And so the features that our grazing animals are looking to exploit to live out their lives are the same features that are often the most productive and interesting to cattle ranching economies. So therein lies the conundrum that we're going to return to towards the end. But let's start out on our tour. So we're on a 7-day, imagine we're on a 7-day wildlife safari, and somehow the 7-day wildlife safari spans over the entirety of the year. So maybe a couple days in the spring, a couple days in summer, fall, winter. And so we are wandering around Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Park. We're encountering all sorts of megafauna. We're encountering mule deer. We're finding black bears foraging in the hawthorns. We're lucky enough to see wolves moving through aspen drainages just as a bud break in the middle of May. We are in the shadows of the Tetons looking at arrowleaf balsam root wildflowers blooming in and amongst the sagebrush fields. And right around the next corner, suddenly we find our first bison, and it's in the right in the geyser basins of Midway and Lower Geyser Basin in Yellowstone, being wafted by the steam from Old Faithful and Castle geysers. But because we are all birders here, the first thing we notice is not, of course, the 2,000-pound bison in the photograph, but the tiny little brown-headed cowbird right in front of the bison. And so in order to get a better look not at the bison but at the cowbirds, we rush over safely and we start pondering the existence of this little bird, because there's some quote that I wish I could remember it off the top of my head here, but John Burroughs had a wonderful quote. I think he was referring to either robins or mallards in this quote, but it's saying something like, you know, how wonderful is it that that no matter where you go in this country, you could move from coast to coast and you could step out of your carriage and into unfamiliar territory, and here you are greeted by a friend from back home, whether that be a robin, mallard, can't remember again what he was talking about. But in this case, we've come all the way across the country and we find a familiar, well, maybe a familiar friend to some, but maybe a familiar foe to others. This brown-headed cowbird is a very maligned species around the Northeast here, right? Because they're nest parasites. They lay their eggs in other birds' nests. And to the great peril of many species of songbirds in our region. I think they lay their eggs in about 200 different songbird species nests. And cowbirds are, you know, they're native, but they're problematic. And so here we are seeing these cowbirds in a totally different context. And because of that, these cowbirds suddenly have a very different story that makes a heck of a lot more sense. So cowbirds have evolved to do this, not to hang out on your front lawn at the edge of the golf course, but to do this, to hang out in and among the bison herds and to literally surf the bison herds around the country. Brown-headed cowbirds should really be called brown-headed bison birds, I think. And the idea is these cowbirds, they perch on the back of the bison, and as the bison move through the grass, sweeping their head side to side, foraging, they scare up insects. And the cowbird flies off the head of the bison and grabs those insects. So imagine you're a cowbird, and the only way that you can forage, the only way you know how to forage, is to use bison as a moving perch. And you go and build a nest and lay a bunch of eggs and try to rear your own chicks, and then suddenly your perch moves 30 miles away. Well, there's no way for a cowbird to be able to rear chicks on their own and still maintain that tether to their herd. And so they've evolved to do away with nesting on their own altogether. And they've sacrificed, they've left their, so they leave their eggs in other birds' nests in order for them to be able to continue following around the herds. So just if you haven't really thought about that connection with cowbirds before, it's an interesting one. So next time you see a cowbird up here in Vermont, we may not have bison in Vermont, but we do have the next best thing, is their best friend, the cowbird. So we're watching these bison and we're watching the cowbirds, and before you know it, we're surrounded by bison. And this is a great opportunity to learn a little bit more about the bison. And we're going to linger on this photograph because it's really instructive about kind of all things bison. So first of all, we look at these bison. Again, it's the end of May here. And we see that these bison look like they're covered in a blanket, right? This light brown blanket. And these two bison in the foreground, these are young males, young bulls. And that light brown blanket that they have on them is actually their winter fur that is still attached to them. So it's almost like they're wearing a Velcro blanket, and that the temperatures are warming up. They no longer have a need for this incredibly insulative fur. And so the follicles have detached a long time ago, but the fur is so thick and so warm in the winter that it all dreads together and gets all matted up and gnarly and stuff. And so bison spend an extraordinary amount of time in the spring trying to find sharp, pokey things in the environment to scratch up against and wear off that fur. And so if you wander around this landscape, you actually find clumps of bison fur on every branch of sagebrush, and especially on the sides of lodgepole pine trees, stuffed into the bark of the sides of the pine trees that are facing these meadows. In fact, those of you that remember the 1988 forest fires of Yellowstone back 32 years ago, there was a time where military firefighting helicopters had landed in the park and were stationed in the park to help with the firefighting efforts. And they ended up having to move the helicopters because the bison were rubbing up on the helicopters to try to scrape their winter fur off and cause lots of problems. So that's the winter fur we're seeing. Now let's talk about how we know these are bulls rather than cows. So you'll have to take my word for this on this slide, but then compare future slides to it. You'll see their horns are nice and big where they meet the skull. The diameter of that horn is about the size of a baseball, approaching almost a softball in size where it meets the skull. And those horns then go straight up in the air. They point up straight up like football goalposts almost. And they also have really big humps, and they have big shaggy manes. But these are not big like bruiser bulls. These are younger males. But the other thing that's significant that tells us that these are bulls and not cows is just context. These two bison are separate from the rest of the herd in the background. And so what's happening is that these, this is true of most grazing animals, is that the goals and priorities of the males of the species are way different than that of the females. And in most species other than birds really, the male, same with bison, the males have very little, have very little to do with rearing the young. They're there for the mating portion of the activities, and that's it. And so meanwhile, females are trying to raise the calves all on their own. And so if you're a female, you need to protect the calf. And to do so, there's safety in numbers, being with other cows or female bison, being with other cows, being with other subadult males. Being in a herd is a great way to protect the calves. Meanwhile, the males, they're big enough and strong enough that they're not going to be messed with by any wolf or grizzly bear or any potential predator like that. And so they just hang out by themselves or in small little bachelor groups like this. So oftentimes we can get a sense of whether they're male or female just by their position in relation to the herd and the landscape. The last thing I want to linger on this slide before we move on in our little tour here is just the quick, like, what's a bison and what's a buffalo thing, since this talk is called Buffalo Country. And the short answer is bison taxonomically are not buffalo. Buffalo taxonomically are referring to Cape buffalo and water buffalo and those Eurasian species. Bison are a different taxonomic lineage. However, if you're referring to an animal in North America, whether you call it bison or buffalo, there's only one thing you could be talking about. And so we use the term interchangeably, bison, buffalo. We're all talking about the thing that looks like this. So we move on in our tour, we go approach the other side of the herd, and we come across a cow. You can see she's got some of her winter fur peeling off her back shoulders right there. And one thing we notice about her is that it looks like she has swallowed a oak barrel. She is huge, and this is late spring here. And so she is about ready to give birth in the next day or two. And when she does so, it'll have been after gestating for about 8 months. And most of the bison in a herd all give birth right about the same time, within, plus or minus, 4 days, 5 days, a week, something like that, so that the bison cows can all kind of work together to act as like a nursery for the calves. And so when she does give birth to the calf, it'll look something like this. It's about 35 pounds, and it's this like bright neon orange color, and that's basically about the size of a golden retriever. So imagine giving birth to a golden retriever. And speaking of dogs, these little bison calves are actually called red dogs. And they're called red dogs, well, obviously because of that fur. And so drawing our attention to this fur here, one of the questions I had when I first saw these bison calves, and this same is true of moose calves, elk calves, they're this bright orange color. What on earth could be the utility of being a neon orange color in a giant bright green landscape? If you're an animal that's trying to avoid being detected by predators, why would you be this color that stands out? And I'm just going to switch to this next slide because that orange is just so nice and prominent here in this calf. So to our eyes, I guess I should say those of us that are not red-green colorblind, this calf stands out sharply against the grass. if you are red-green colorblind, then you are seeing the same thing that a wolf or a grizzly bear might be seeing in this particular context. And that is to the predators, potential predators of these bison calves, they don't have the same visual acuity as some other animals, or birds especially. And so the bison calf actually blends right into the grass, according to the predators. And so what stands out like a sore thumb to me is actually perfectly camouflaged to a wolf. So our calf will then nurse for the next several months, and it'll kind of go back and forth between nursing and eating grass, and the mother will slowly wean the calf off of her milk over the span of the rest of the growing season and in the first part of the winter. And these are times of plenty for all of our big grazing animals in the area. Late May and June is a great time to be alive because everything is green, everything is lush. And anywhere you put your head down within 30 miles of you is going to be edible, which is a pretty astonishing thought. But just as soon as the temperatures, and I should also mention that, this calories in versus calories out thing I was talking about back in the beginning, you're trying to maximize the amount of calories you take in and minimize the amount of calories you're spending. This is the one time of year we have such a surplus of incoming calories that you can afford to play. Here's a couple of mama bison chasing their calves around for fun. And you can see the background is still quite snowy too. I'm just going to go back and play it one more time, if it lets me. Nope. So we are going to transition now from spring over to summer. Things are starting to turn brown. I have a sound effect going in the background, and one of our great moderators can tune in and let me know if my voice is being cut out by that the audio in the background. But hopefully I'm good. Okay. Great. So this background noise here is just the background rumbles of a bison herd in summer. And this is the reason for that. Those two bull bison we were looking at back earlier have nothing on this guy. This guy is probably 10, 11 years old. He is topping out at 2,000 pounds. He could squash a VW bug. He can run 30 miles an hour. He can jump over a split rail fence without any problem. And for some reason, this is the time of year and the type of bison that people insist on wanting to go up and trying to pet. And every single year you see these news stories, and I've seen it in real life, of people wanting to go up and approach our bison. Not that this is ever a good time of year to do so, but or I should say, there's never a good time to go pet a bison, but especially not in the bison mating season, because this bison has one thing on his mind. He is hopped up on testosterone, and he's going to spend most of his summer tussling with other bulls in sparring matches. And these sparring matches can get violent, powerful. They rocket dirt up in the air, form these like tornadoes of dust on a still day. And so I'm going to switch over to a couple of videos here to show you what this kind of looks like, what this sounds like when these bison are really hopped up on testosterone. And we'll talk a little bit about what the bison kind of mating display looks like, what the mating season looks like. So again, I don't know why people insist on wanting to go pet a bison like that, but you can see that guy drooling and stomping and kicking, and he started bellowing even louder upon hearing the grunt of a neighboring bison. But what's happening is the bison mating season is about a month long, But any given female in the herd is only going to be in estrus for a couple of days of that, maybe 3 or 4 days at the most. And so the bull bison that have been wandering around the landscape by themselves all year come back and join the herd, and they smell, they try to get a scent of the pheromones of the females to determine which bison is in estrus. And then a big bull bison will come over and kind of hang out with her for 3 or 4 days on end. He'll mate several times in that period, but then he'll guard her so that no other bull bison can have access. And so he'll protect her, or I should say he'll protect his investment against any other bull bison that are in the area. So this video here that I'm going to play is an example of the bison on the left is the bull and the one on the right is the cow. And there's a third bison behind both of them. And that's a bull bison that's not quite as big as the dominant one here. And you can see him rolling around in the dirt and bellowing and drooling. And the champion here is not even paying him any attention whatsoever. Hear a raven gargling in the background there too. So for several days on end, the bull is not going to leave the side of the cow, and it's a little bizarre because like if she even gets up and moves like 3 feet away to like grab an extra clump of grass, he's going to follow right alongside of her. And if she gets up and runs away, he's going to be right on her heels. And so it's almost like they're attached by a tether, and she must, I'm sure, find it very annoying. But that's kind of the way it goes. And you saw that bison in the last video rolling around in the dirt. Now in the last video, it was a misty, hazy day. And so what wasn't being conveyed is that when they do roll around in the dirt, they actually, on a nice sunny clear day, they kick up all sorts of dust like this. And just with one roll, they can put up a whole bunch of dirt into the air. They roll around in these wallows that are areas that they have historically used for this purpose year after year after year. So there's no grass, there's no seed bank in those wallows. So when they roll, they can kick up a big storm of dust that looks very intimidating to other bison that might want to compete. And then the last little video of this season I want to show you is just a big bull bison coming right at us. And the end of this short little clip has a child's voice in it, which might be disconcerting considering that there's a 2,000-pound bison barreling down on us. I just want to assure you that we're safely inside of a vehicle. And so if you needed any more convincing to not go pet a bison, here it is. I'm noticing that this bison also has all sorts of debris stuck in his other horn from tearing up sagebrush as a dominance kind of display. All right, so we're transitioning out of summer now. Our tour has gone on for months now, and now it's starting to become winter. And when it was previously 75, 80 degrees Fahrenheit in the daytime, now we're approaching September and October, and there's sleet and freezing rain on a pretty regular basis. Our bison calf that was nice and bright red back in May and June has now taken on its winter fur. So it's grown in nice and thick, and it's changed its colors to match its mother. And so here's what those two look like together. And for this bison calf, this is the hardest, it's entering the hardest time of its entire life. Bison can live 25 to 30 years, no problem. But the hardest point to get over is that very first winter, being a young bison calf. Because one of the bison's greatest advantages to being able to survive in these cold places like Yellowstone is their size. There's this kind of well understood rule in winter survival, winter physiology, where the larger you are, the better you can maintain the body heat that you do have. The idea being that if you take a gallon of water and you put it in the microwave and put it outside on a cold day, you do the same thing with a pint glass of water, the pint of water is going to cool down to ambient temperature much faster than the gallon will. So the bigger you are, the better you can maintain the body heat that you do have. So even if you have nice thick winter fur, If you are only 200 pounds instead of 2,000 pounds, winter's going to be a lot harder for you. And so these temperatures, it's hard to really fathom what 30 degrees or 40 degrees below zero feels like. That's the temperature at which like all the engine fluids start leaking out of your car because all the rubber hoses stop expanding and contracting and in relation to your, like all the gaskets and stuff that they're built into. It's the temperature at which when you look through a spotting scope, your other eye freezes shut and you have to hold your hand over your eye to melt the ice off your eyelashes. So pretty cold, but other days aren't quite so bad. And this is kind of what the area looks like. In this particular region of the park, we have herds moving through the landscape, finding areas of that are windswept, that might have more available forage that isn't buried underneath snow. And of course, the geyser basins in this region are also important places where these bison spend a lot of time, because the warmth from the geothermal features actually melts the snow and allows access to forage that might be easier to get to than some other places. But all in all, you know, these bison are actually extraordinarily comfortable, given how uncomfortable the environment is around them. In winter ecology, there's also this concept of your kind of lower critical temperature threshold. And there's also an upper temperature threshold as well. But think of it as like every species has this sweet spot where below a certain temperature or above a certain temperature, the body has to increase its metabolism in order to either sweat and then evaporate moisture to cool down, or increase metabolism to generate more body heat. And for us humans, we're wimps, and anything that's like below 60 degrees and we get really cold, and anything that's above about 75, 80 degrees, we're too hot. But for a bison, it can be equally happy at 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Or once it puts on its winter fur, it can be totally comfortable at -40. And when we look at the metabolic rate of this guy here covered in frost, it's the same as his metabolic rate in the summer if he's sitting around, on a nice 70 degree day. So pretty fantastic that they can conserve their body heat so well that it doesn't even melt the snow off their back. And this provides for awesome opportunities for photographs of frosty bison in the steam of the geothermal features. Another trick that bison have up their sleeve is that they have ruminant digestive systems. So they are able to get a lot more nutrition out of foods that we couldn't survive off of, right? When they're eating dead grass, they're able to digest the cellulose and lignin from that to be able to actually turn that into calories and turn that into heat. So they'll use that giant head that they have, and that big hump on their back, I should mention, that is iconic to bison, is actually muscle attachment. And that muscle attachment from their head up to the shoulder allows them to sweep their head through the snow like they're flicking out of the way like styrofoam. And so they'll spend a lot of time sweeping their head around to open up a bare little piece of ground. They'll vacuum up the grass there and move on. And some bison have figured out that, and you'll see this with other animals too, is that if you find an open stretch of water, that open water means that there's going to be forage right along the edge of that waterway that hasn't been covered up in snow. And so you'll see that the grass over like at the edge of the stream here already looks like it's been mowed down by the last bison to come through here. So imagine trying to find a meal in this kind of environment. And if that wasn't enough, all of that wasn't enough, we have the additional problem where there's things out there trying to eat you meanwhile. And if you joined me for my wolf talk last year, this is the same video as last year, but we're going to examine it from the bison's perspective instead of the wolf's perspective. And this is a stressful video to watch, but no bison were ultimately harmed in this video. And keep an eye on my cursor. I'm going to do my best to keep the cursor on the bison calf that's in the middle of this little herd of bison. And so I want you to watch the bison calf and how the wolves are positioning themselves to try to access this calf, and how the bison are reacting to defend against the wolves. So that wolf going right for the bison calf there, gets it by the back legs, but then one of the females stomps her off. The calf gets away and starts jetting back to the herd with a defense from mom on the left. And now the herd is really trying to bury this calf right in the middle. These cow bison here are 1,200, 1,300, maybe even 1,400 pounds. Each one of these wolves is about 130 pounds, really at the most. And so this is dangerous business to try to approach a herd of something 10 times your size looking for dinner. One well-placed or even not so well-placed kick from one of these bison can end a wolf, break a bunch of ribs, stomp its foot, and render it basically a long and slow death. And so just their size and the strength of their kicks is what keeps them safe and was keeping the calf safe. Now something a little different is starting to happen where the wolves are giving up on this calf. They're still keeping an eye on it. But what they're noticing now is that there's one bison that has a limp in its back right leg, and it's this one right here. So watch the back right leg, and so you'll see that she's going to start to be favoring that. And the wolves are noticing that this bison is a little bit unsteady on her feet. And what's going to happen is that this wolf is coming around here to draw the bison away from the herd, get it to give chase. And as soon as it does, the rest of the herd, or the rest of the pack, then starts to isolate this bison from the rest of the herd. And so normally this is not a good situation, right? If you're with a bunch of your friends, you can kick your way out of a situation like this. But if you're injured and your back right leg isn't working so well, and you have a pack of 10 wolves on you that have experience hunting wolves, this becomes problematic. But she is heading in a direction very strategically, because coming from the other direction over here, you'll see is a big bull bison who has another 400 or 500 pounds on her. And as soon as the wolves realize that this bull has entered the conversation, the wolves start to really change their attitude about this hunting strategy. Here's our bull. So they let the female walk off. Now they're kind of rethinking their plan. And this wolf here, which actually looks like an older pup, is just going to give up and head out. So, in addition to trying to survive winter, you also have to survive that. But against all odds, our mama bison and the calf survive the winter, and you know, a little bit worse for the wear, right? You can see every last rib on mom. You can see the short ribs over here, and you can see her hip bones. But since the grass is starting to turn green here, the pantry is stocked, as it were, now, and so she'll be able to put on this weight no problem from here on out for the rest of the year once winter's over. So as the winter ends, there's a major difference between what it looks like up in the high country and what it looks like down low. This is what it looks like up at 8,000-9,000 feet, some of the plateaus, and this is what it looks like elsewhere. And so there's a huge difference between where the bison have basically a huge range of options of places they could be, and they want to be down in the warmest, most comfortable places where they can start eating grasses and forbs and things like that. But to do so, they have to leave the park, and that's where things get really, really interesting. That's when inside this gate, they merely only have to deal with wolves and grizzlies and finding food under snow and all this kind of stuff. But once they leave the park, now things get more complicated, and we start to have a war over grass and who gets to eat it. So I'm going to pause there for a moment and also honor the fact that of course I'm already going over time, but I want to just take if there's a couple of questions there on bison ecology or bison biology that would be helpful to tackle now, I'd be happy to. Then
Sean, we have 3 questions.
Sure.
The first question is, are the bison able to see red-green? So can the cows see their young?
That's a really good question. I'm maybe somebody can do a little Google searching in the remainder of the talk here, but I would put money on that they can see red green for the purpose of being able to see their cap, but also for the purpose of being able to see their food really well too.
The second question is, after the males mate and hang out for a few days with one female, do they go search out another female?
Yes, thank you for that. That's a great question. So they do. So over the course of that month of the mating season, a dominant bull bison might mate with 9, 10, 12 females, but sequentially, but all one at a time.
The last question that has been posted is, I think you said that all calves are born within a few days, which means females are out of season very quickly. Is that good for genetic diversity?
I don't know. Well, all the females give birth to their calves around the same time, but not so. The herd is not one. All of the bison in Yellowstone don't hang out in one big herd. They are subgroups. They all split. This kind of moves around like an amoeba. And so, any group of bison, let's say there's a group of 30 or 40 females together. That group might have their bison pretty close to the same time period. But that might be a week or two different than this other group of bison over there. Just between Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Park, there's about a 1 month difference in when the herds on average give birth to their young. So there is plenty of variance across geography in when bison calves are born, even though within one subgroup, if you could call it that, they'll all be pretty close to the same time.
Well, we have two questions now. First, from Bruce McPherson, what is the historic range of bison?
Oh, that's a great question. I'll get to that in just a moment.
Okay, and the last question we have is, do females' horns grow curved versus how the male's horns grow straight up?
Absolutely, yes. That's generally speaking the case. Sometimes it's hard to tell that the diameter where the base of the horn meets the skull is the best. But in this instance, for example, like this bison here is definitely a bull, goes straight up like this. This one here is definitely a cow. It curls in like crescents. This one here is a cow. This one here, can't quite see enough to tell what's going on. But I would say that's probably a bull, actually, younger bull. But yeah, so the fact that those horns curl in like crescent moons is actually diagnostic for females. Yep. Yeah, thanks.
And for those of you who joined us in the first half of the presentation, Sean is going to now give a second part to his presentation. And as we just did, if you have any questions, please direct them in the chat. They will come to me. And at the end of the presentation, he will take the rest of the questions.
Great. So when Lewis and Clark, so we're going to talk about the war on grass a little bit, and there's a big part of this story that I'm not going to be able to cover that is a really important one. I decided it would be best to just just call it out and say that's a different conversation than to not do it justice. And that's the conversation between the relationship between Native Americans and bison, and the relationship between us and Europeans and white people and bison and Native Americans, and kind of the story of genocide and extermination of bison that have to do with that. And so I do want to hit on that at some point because there's a lot to be said there. But in the interest of time, I decided that I want to just refocus specifically on the bison here and talk more about a little bit about the history of what their historic range is, where they are now. So when Lewis and Clark moved across the country in 1803, they described bison as, this is a powerful quote, the moving multitude that darkened the plains. These were herds that were estimated, it was estimated that the Western bison population was somewhere between 30 million and 60 million bison. And the herd actually originally spanned quite dramatically in range. The colored parts of this map are areas that once had bison, And so down here in the southern part, this is the range of the American Plains bison up here, and this more orange is the wood buffalo, which is a different subspecies that looks pretty much the same. And then I think around the fringes here is hypothesized range of the bison too. So it's interesting that Buffalo, New York actually did once have buffalo. And fascinatingly, like the buffalo once extended into the spine of the Appalachians, can be found pretty far east. But those bison were really knocked back in their range pretty dramatically and pretty quickly as European settlement moved across the West. So, you know, the eastern states lost any bison they had by the mid 1700s, late 1700s. As we approached the Midwest, those bison were wiped out by the 1820s to 1840s. And basically by the end of the 1800s, by the late 1890s, there was only a couple of places left in the entire planet that had wild bison. Between market hunting and just recreational shooting bison off the back of trains as people went from coast to coast in the train, and the explicit extermination of bison by the U.S. military as a way to weaken Native American tribes. We ended up taking that population of 60 million bison and reducing it down to the point where there was 23 in Yellowstone, and there was another couple of dozen down in the panhandle of Texas that were wild herds that had been driven and corralled from the Dakotas down there and were being held there. And that was about it for wild bison. And through a ton of work by Yellowstone National Park, but also especially the American Bison Society, which was headed up by Teddy Roosevelt, William Temple Hornaday back in around 1905 or so. Bison were taken from the existing herds and those herds were used to repopulate public lands that had historically had them. Now, I say that there's only a handful of wild bison left in the world, but there were still a fair amount of like domestic livestock bison. So domesticated is a hard word to use with bison, but there were people that were ranching bison and bison cattle hybrids for meat. And so even though we lost almost all of our wild bison, there were some small populations of kind of genetically hybrid bison cattle, beefalo we'll call them. And because they look so similar genetically, or they look so similar to wild bison, and at the time we didn't really know anything about genetics, those herds were used to repopulate places throughout the West. And so all of these different dots on this map now are places where there are currently herds of wild bison. So bison were saved really from the brink of extinction after being one of the most, perhaps, the greatest amount of biomass in our nation. 30 to 60 million animals of this 2,000-pound creature reduced to a couple of handfuls, and now restored back to the point where there's about 50,000 bison. Sorry, there's 50,000 wild bison in the world. Yellowstone has the largest herd at about 5,000. And there's about 400,000 to 500,000 farm-raised bison in the livestock industry as well. So it's a conservation success story that they didn't go extinct, and that we can go to many of our public lands around the West and see bison. So let's now follow these bison as they leave the park, and recognizing that little bit of history there, and also just acknowledging the fact that I've left out a whole lot about the story of the extermination of bison. Let's just move to the chapter that is still being written right now. The chapter that I'm going to end this talk here with this portion about what's going on with these bison and what are we supposed to do with them. So this is where they're coming from in the late winter, places like this. And this is where they're trying to get to, is places like this. Now, not all of the bison in Yellowstone leave the park in the winter. There's about 5,000 bison in the park, but on average, about 1,000 bison a year try to leave Yellowstone. And in doing so, they find themselves between a rock and a hard place. And that's because when bison leave the park doesn't want them back. And yet no one wants them outside the park either. And so what is a bison to do if it walks over this imaginary line and now it isn't tolerated on one side or the other side of that line? Let's explore this a little bit. Well, first of all, why can't we put them back? Why can't you just put them back into the park? Well, the reason for that is there is about, again, 5,000 bison in Yellowstone. And this here is a picture of the Lamar Valley in the northeastern portion of Yellowstone. This is a major bison summering ground. And you can see that it looks a little bit like a golf course fairway with a creek going through it. And that's because of the historically extremely high grazing pressure that this valley has received. Bison eat a lot of grass. And back in the early days of the bison restoration in Yellowstone, there weren't very many of them. And the herds really topped out around 1,000 or so. But over the last 50 years or so, that number has been increasing to about 5,000 or so now. The park, this 2.2 million acre park, can only really sustain about 3,500 bison. That's the carrying capacity of how many bison can be grazing on this landscape in such a way that's not going to negatively impact the rest of the ecosystem. And so the National Park Service and the interagency bison management team, they recognize that, you know, in an ideal world, they put them back in the park, but putting the bison back in the park is actually to the detriment of every other species in the park. All the other grazing animals, the vegetation layer, etc. So they're not tolerated inside the park, at least not above their carrying capacity. So, you know, if there was only 2,000 bison in the park and they left, then they try to push them back. But since there's so many of them, once they leave, it's not in the best interest of the park to put them back there. And also there's like the logistical portion of this too. Like, not that anyone's tried, but like imagine trying to push a herd of bison where you want them to go. Like, it is really hard to get bison to do what you want. And so just saying put them back in the park is not exactly logistically very easy to do. So that's a significant thing too. So if we can't put them back, why not just let them roam? Why not just let them hang out outside the park and go where they please? Well, there's some major reasons why that is problematic. And that's because this picture here is in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. It's right outside the edge of the park. And this is what it looks like when you leave the park. This is the Paradise Valley in southern Montana. And this is where bison want to go, given if they had it their way. But this is ranch land, right? And the most expensive piece of a rancher's budget is winter food, feeding your cattle throughout the winter. And the best way to get that winter food is to grow it yourself, which is not cheap, but it's a lot cheaper than having to buy hay and feed it to your cattle. So imagine 60 bison wander onto your ranch land, and each one of those bison is eating about 24 pounds of grass per day, and they're there for an entire weekend. Those bison have eaten 2,880 pounds of your grass. And that is not an insignificant amount of money that rancher has now lost because of this herd of bison that's wandered on there. And so this war over grass is a real problem. So bison just aren't tolerated outside the park, or I should say they're not tolerated by the ranching industry because, if nothing else, they eat a ton of grass, and that's competition for their cattle. To say nothing of what bison can do to a barbed wire fence if they put their mind to it. They are not as easily contained as a herd of cattle are by things like a barbed wire fence held up by old dried out dead wood. Okay, well, if they leave the park and they're not allowed on the ranch lands outside the park, can we just like pick them up or put them in corrals somehow and move them somewhere else? That sounds great. There's tons of places around the West that would love to have their own wild bison herds. Can't we just move them? Well, no. This picture here is actually the culmination of about 10 years of incredibly complicated work to make it possible for this bison to be, and its kin to be, released into this spot. I think this is the Fort Peck Reservation in northeast Montana. The problem is that these bison have a disease called brucellosis. And not just a few of them, but like 60% of Yellowstone's bison are positive for this bacterial disease called brucellosis. And that's true of elk as well. Somewhere between like 30 and 50% or maybe even more of the elk herds in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem also have brucellosis. And brucellosis is a disease that is usually actually asymptomatic in bison and in elk. So it's not doesn't really affect the bison and elk populations to a very great degree. But in cattle, if cattle get brucellosis, it causes the cows to abort their fetus. So it causes miscarriage, and it can do it repeatedly year after year. And it also causes all sorts of problems with milk production and some other things. And so brucellosis is really bad news for a cattle herd, just from the standpoint of reproduction of your herd. But also economically, it's a disaster if your cows get brucellosis. If one of your cattle tests positive for brucellosis, your entire herd is slaughtered. And in Montana and Wyoming, these are states that have worked really hard to eradicate brucellosis from the livestock industry. And so as a result, the way in which you can transport and move cattle around it's pretty easy. But as soon as these states start having serious problems with brucellosis in the livestock, that'll require a lot more permitting and licensing and a lot more expenses. And suddenly it'll become a lot more, it'll just be another budget item for ranchers to have to deal with when they're already working on a razor thin margin. So because of this brucellosis situation, bison can't just be picked up and moved somewhere else, because if those bison somewhere else interact with cattle, there's a possibility for them to transmit brucellosis to those cattle. Okay, well, can't we, first of all, what about the elk? Don't elk have the same brucellosis as the bison do? Well, yes. And how come no one seems to care about elk on private ranch land? And to a degree they do, and ranchers typically aren't excited about having herds of elk on their ranch lands either. But elk have a huge $230 million hunting industry attached to them in Montana alone. And so elk hunting is such a huge economic driver that there's a lot more cultural and economic tolerance and industry tolerance for elk on the landscape than there are for bison. But we're not here to talk about elk, we're here to talk about bison. So if they have brucellosis, can't we just quarantine them and then vaccinate them, right? Wouldn't that be a dream? Well, of course, that's more complicated than it seems as well, because there is a brucellosis vaccine, but it's not hugely effective. It's hard to tell if it's worked or not. And it's also temporary. It only lasts a year or two. False negatives are a really big problem when you're testing for brucellosis. This bacteria can lay kind of dormant in your system for potentially years. And so an animal can test negative for brucellosis time and time again, and then a year later can test positive despite not having had any further interactions with any brucellosis positive animals. And as a result, if you're going to quarantine bison, you have to quarantine them for a very, very long time in order to be sure that they don't have brucellosis. We're talking like 2+ years. Incidentally, this herd here, after 2 years of quarantine and feeding them every day for 2 years, 24 pounds of grass per bison, it's $250,000 a year just to feed these bison, right, that are in quarantine. 2 days before they're going to be released, some activists came and they cut open a hole in the fence to let them out. And in so doing, set the clock back on the quarantine 2 years because the bison couldn't be recaptured. Some of them just got away for good, and the other bison they just couldn't capture before they had been interacting significantly with other bison. So anyway, so it's complicated to quarantine bison, and it's really expensive, and you can't afford to get it wrong. You can't afford to mess it up, because if you transport a bison that has brucellosis inadvertently and you put it out in the wild, it's very hard to get that bison back. It's going to go where it wants to go. And then furthermore, there's 1,000 bison a year that are leaving Yellowstone, right? And a quarantine facility, the quarantine facilities that we have right now can only really handle 100 or 200 bison. And so there's still this 800 bison leftovers that we can't possibly quarantine even in an ideal world right now. So what do we do with the remaining? Let's say we could just wave our hands and the quarantine and vaccination thing was fine. What do we do about the other 800 bison that are leaving the park that ecologically don't make sense to put back in there and aren't tolerated anywhere else? Well, can we just cull them? Can we just slaughter those bison, from a population management perspective? And that is exactly what the Park Service and the interagency bison management team has been doing. Is every year they'll do a big bison cull, where they'll go and they'll round up and they'll slaughter these bison. And of course, that has been met with a tremendous amount of protests and unhappy citizens and all sorts of unhappy stakeholders, because you're killing a cultural icon, a national icon, you're killing something that belongs in the public trust. And it's kind of just a big deal, killing 800 bison once they step over the edge of this Yellowstone National Park boundary. But it's complicated. So the culling has been happening every year for over 10 years now, and about 3,500 bison have been slaughtered in this culling program. And everybody recognized that this is not the ideal situation. If there was a better alternative, we wouldn't be culling these bison, but there's not really a better alternative. And so it continues. And so we've tried to work around this or try to come up with other solutions as well, and that is to hunt them. And this is one of the most wonderful stories of conservation success that also happens to be one of the more brutal stories of well, I mean, you'll see what I mean in a second, but several years ago, there was a tribal bison hunt that was opened up on the bison that leave the park. So every year, Native Americans come from as far away as Wisconsin and Oregon. They're coming from the Nez tribe, the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribes, the Yakima Nation, the Umatilla Reservation. There's folks coming from all over to this coordinated, very highly regulated bison hunt, so that Native American groups can be able to harvest this animal that is so incredibly culturally significant to them. Not only is it incredibly culturally and spiritually significant, these animals that their people depended on for thousands and thousands of years, but at the end of the day, each one of these is, if you harvest one of these bison, you're going home with over 1,000 pounds of meat that can feed you and your family and your neighbors for the whole year. So it's a big deal, and I think a really awesome thing that this bison hunt, that the solution to culling the herd has been met with the response of introducing a tribal bison hunt. And so about 300 bison a year are killed in this hunt. So it would be great if that was it for the story of this hunt. However, in reality, things are a little more complicated than that. And so a little warning, the next slide is going to be a little graphic here. It's going to have some gut piles of some harvested bison. So you can look away for a moment while you listen to me here if you don't want to see that. But the way this has gone down is that this has been kind of like from an optics perspective, this bison hunt does not look good. And that's because you can't hunt the bison inside Yellowstone National Park. End of story. However, once you leave the park and go too far, you're in ranch lands and developments and places where you can't safely have a hunt because there's people and livestock and buildings and you just can't have a hunt. Meanwhile, bison are only going to move through these valley bottoms. They're not going to be moving through the hills and cliffs and things like that. And so what that leaves us with is the reality that when bison leave the park, they almost exclusively leave the park through this one corridor. And there's this one area that's about 30 acres in size where people can stand and hunt these bison as they walk across the park line, literally. So they're literally gunned down. Well, the one way to phrase it would be they're gunned down at the border by the dozens, which is true. The other way to phrase it is these bison are being harvested in a highly regulated bison hunt that's being extended to Native American tribes to be able to access this resource that has been denied of their people for the last century. So yeah, it's a little complicated, but that's the reality of what this hunt is about, but then also what it looks like, in the press, for instance. And the last piece of this rock in a hard place, I'll transition a little bit, is like, okay, we're working towards being able to better handle the surplus of bison, but we're not there yet. We're expanding quarantine facilities. We're trying out the methodologies. We're trying to get this right, but we don't yet have enough capacity to be able to handle all these bison that are leaving the park. Can we just like give them to somebody? And so the interagency bison team here, all these stakeholders, they actually approached Ted Turner, founder of CNN, largest private landowner in the United States. He has like 250,000 acres of land across the West. And he owns over 50,000 bison. He owns them for livestock purposes. But he was approached by the Yellowstone bison management people saying, hey, can you babysit our bison for the next 5 years while we figure out a way to deal with the surplus of bison that are leaving the park? And Ted Turner said, I'd be happy to, but the deal is I get 90% of the offspring of those bison. And so here we have a situation where the bison, and this actually kind of went through. And so Ted Turner is hanging on to 100 Yellowstone bison right now that belong to the Yellowstone herd. But Turner gets to keep the vast majority of the offspring that those bison have as his fee for managing these bison, which has created this big question around what does it mean when you have this animal that's held in public trust that US tax dollars are being paid to manage, and you're giving them to a private entity, a private person who is profiting off of the proliferation of these species. What's the ethics of that? What's the legality of that? And I'm not here to answer that question. I'm just here to continue making this an even pricklier topic of what the heck to do with all of these bison. And so we're left with the big question mark at the end of the day is, what are we supposed to do with these bison? What's the best thing to do? And that's why I say this chapter is still being written right now. And so I think that the place to end is really just to think about what do we need and what do the bison need? And can we agree on those things at least and recognize that this is a messy story? And so we can agree that the bison need room to roam. They need to be able to leave the park. They need to be able to go places. They need to be able to be tolerated. Not everywhere, but they need to have places where they can be tolerated. And so that's a cultural thing, and that's a geography thing. And then what do we need? Well, we need to be able to be comfortable with give and take. In many ways, it's a huge conservation success story that we have 5,000 bison that we need to cull. That's a lot better of a problem than having no bison because they're extinct or not enough to meet our to hit carrying capacity in the park. And so recognizing that it's a success story that we're starting with, it's a good take to have. This give and take is really important. And we need to recognize that there are actually incompatible interests here that we have to work around. There is no world in which the bison population, the increase of the bison population and the increased tolerance of bison populations can come at the expense of the Montana cattle industry. Like that's just not going to happen. And it doesn't need to be, that's not a zero-sum game, I don't think. I think that we can recognize those incompatibilities and then work around it and find alternative solutions that don't rely on the sacrifice of Montana's cattle ranchers, at least not to a very significant margin. And then finally, like all things, we need to pour money and resources into this. If the bison management team had more money, had more resources, they'd be able to quarantine the vast majority of these bison that leave the park. They'd be able to do a much better job of moving them around the country once they test negative repeatedly and they can leave that quarantine. And so I just want to think about the needs, our needs, bison's needs, how those things come together, and recognize the whole thing as a conservation success story of an iconic animal, that really touches on a lot of the big issues in wildlife conservation today. So I know I've stolen a little bit of your time. It's now 7:40 here. So thank you for sticking with me, and I'm happy to then let you steal my time, and I will sit here for as long as you want, answering as many questions as you'd like. But I want to thank North Branch Nature Center. I want to thank Green Mountain Audubon Society for having me. I want to thank all of the different entities that are working really hard to figure out what to do with this amazing and complicated animal. So thank you.
Sean, that was fabulous. We have 4 questions for you. Before I give them to you, I just like to point out to our attendees that our next presentation is going to be our rescheduled first of 4 programs by Mav Kim, and its title is New Birder Series, Why Are So Many People Birding These Days?, which will be followed on February 9th with the second Gear Talk, What Do You Need to Get Started with Birding, again by Mav Kim. You can see those times on our website. So again, February 4th, February 9th. Now, the questions, you stirred up some interest. Okay, the first one is about brucellosis.
Yep.
Does brucellosis harm humans who eat the meat?
Brucellosis, humans can contract brucellosis. Brucellosis is carried primarily in the birthing fluid and spinal fluid of animals. And so if you are careful in processing the animal, so that you're not like, cutting spinal fluid and getting it in your hands after cutting yourself, like it's fine. In fact, I would say most of the elk that people are harvesting in Wyoming and Montana are probably brucellosis positive. But it's totally safe to eat the meat. That's totally fine. Let's just not confuse that. I should just mention PSA. Don't confuse that with chronic wasting disease. That is a very different thing. That's much scarier when it comes to whether or not humans can contract it. But brucellosis is safe to eat the meat from a brucellosis positive animal. However, humans can contract brucellosis if they come in contact with that bacteria. And it causes all sorts of like flu-like, almost Lyme disease-like symptoms in people. So it's really bad news if you get it.
You have answered our second question, which was from Carl Runge about transmission to humans. Our third question is from Mav Kim, and she states, I've read that bison are much better for the environment than cattle. Wouldn't one solution be to convince ranchers to substitute their cattle herds with bison herds?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So I think that if you graze bison like you graze cattle, then bison will have the same effect on the landscape as cattle do. I think the reason that cattle have the reputation of really overgrazing the landscape is because that's how that herd is managed to do so. And so I think that bison and cattle have the same propensity to cause destruction if they are, managed in that way. However, there's a big, and there's also the fact that it's way harder to deal with a herd of bison than it is to deal with a herd of cows. Like if you imagine walking around, like if I'm going for a walk, inside of a fence in Vermont around some dairy cows, like I'm not worried about getting trampled by those cows. If those were bison, I would be a lot more concerned, even if those were livestock bison. And so there is actually the factor that it's just harder, more expensive, more complicated to deal with a herd of bison than a herd of cattle. And of course, there's a bigger market for cattle as well. The taste is different. Cattle have fat marbled throughout the meat, which gives it, that nice, beef flavor and texture and all that kind of stuff. Bison meat is delicious, but it's harder to cook, and it's not as there's not quite the same market for it. So I want to bring that question back to birds a little bit, though, because I was chatting with a friend of mine last night, who did her research on interaction between bison grazing and songbirds. And really, it's a story of bison grazing, songbirds, and the vegetation. And so Mav's question is getting at like grazing intensities. What if you graze bison, but you do it in a way that's a lighter touch? And in some ways, this is like science of the obvious to a degree, that like if you turn a beautiful tall grass prairie into a golf course fairway through intensive, or just like, dirt parking lot through heavy grazing, you're not going to have a lot of bird diversity there. Like you might have vesper sparrows, you might have maybe just about vesper sparrows is probably about it. But as you allow for landscape heterogeneity, where you have patches that are grazed more heavily, patches that are grazed less heavily, patches that are kind of grazed somewhere intermediately, you give different habitat types for different species of birds, right? Sage thrashers, green-tailed towhees, they're going to be interested in places that have a lot more sagebrush, a lot more diversity and vegetative structure three-dimensionally. You have other species like maybe like brewer sparrow and the long spurs that are more interested in landscapes that actually have undergone a fair amount of grazing. And so with the right, so when bison are left to themselves, when a wild herd of bison is left to itself and given room to roam, they create this heterogeneous landscape where there's a quilt of different available habitat types throughout the landscape, just based on how the bison move around and how long they spend in any one area and just all that natural variability. If you took a herd of cows and you graze them in such a way that replicated the same thing that bison would do on their own, you'd end up restoring that habitat in a similar fashion. So hopefully that answers your question, and then a little bit more probably, but it's definitely something I'll hopefully talk about somehow tonight.
So we have 3 more questions. I'm going to skip one and come back to one. One has to do with wolves and the other 2 have to do with bison. Mm-hmm. So the first one is, do the male bison join other herds when they mature?
Usually when you see big mature, well, actually this picture right here is a great example. This is a group of 4 mature bull bison, especially that one in the back is looking right at us. So this is a bachelor group, and this is what you see. It's kind of like Statler and Waldorf, like in the Muppets, right? Like the 2 the 2 old guys that sit up in the balcony and complain about everything. I feel like sometimes you see these like just really old bison that are beyond breeding age, that they don't come back into the herds to mate. They're just kind of like living out their lives, eating grass, and you'll see them in these small groups like this. What you never see is a group of like 40 or 50 bulls all hanging out together. That doesn't really happen. The females and the young and the subadult males, so like basically the mature like yearling calves, those will all stick together in larger herds. But the mature males will either be totally solo or just in like really small bachelor groups of like 2 or 3 or 4 like this.
The next question, I'm going to go to the wolf question. Has the introduction of wolves helped to keep the numbers of bison somewhat in check?
Okay, great question. No. So the brown line on this graph, so the x-axis here is time from 1960 to about today. Y-axis is the number of bison in the park in Yellowstone. And the brown line shows the increase in the number of bison over time, but there's also some other lines that they drop in here for reference. So like 1988, we have oh, sorry, I realize you can't see my cursor. 1988, we have the park wildfires that happened here. 1995 is when wolves were reintroduced into the park, right? Now, you'll see here, there's a big drop in the bison numbers. And if you really want to put together a convenient story, you could say that the introduction of the wolves caused this drop in the bison numbers. However, what you also see is at that same exact time, that same time period, that was when the first culling of the bison herds started to happen. And so really the wolves are not the cause of this giant drop in the population. It's actually has more to do with the hunting and the harvesting and the culling processes that were put in place. And meanwhile, we see the bison herd continues to go up and down, but on the whole, it's increasing still, despite the fact that wolves are well established in the landscape, and grizzly bears, which will depredate bison calves, grizzly bear populations are also very robust in this landscape as well.
In the interest of time, there are a few more questions. I'm going to limit it to the 2 which have now been received. Do the culled animals get eaten?
Oh yes, thank you. Yeah, the meat is not wasted. The meat is given to like food pantries and organizations like Hunters for the Hungry and things like that. So the meat is definitely not wasted. So that's important to note that yeah, it's not a waste. The meat is being used in those calls.
And the last one is perhaps you can decide if it's controversial. How about disallowing the ranchers from grazing their cattle on public lands?
Yeah, that's such an interesting piece. So um, so on in national park, so we have all sorts of different designations of public lands, right? In national parks, you're not going to find a rancher grazing their cattle inside Yellowstone, for instance. And on national forest lands, it really depends on the forest, on that particular national forest and their policies and their rules, and also the different management units within that. But there are other types of lands, particularly like Bureau of Land Management lands, which are big, huge, wide open swaths of publicly owned land that are often, for simplicity's sake, just like wide open for ranchers to be able to graze their cattle on that land. Now, the little bit of complexity that's involved here is that if I was a rancher and I wanted to graze my cattle on public land instead of on my own land, I would only have to pay about $2 a head per cow per year to just like throw my cows out on BLM land and then come pick them up again at the end of the year. And so that's very small price to pay for having a very, very high, in some cases, grazing intensity on landscapes that can't necessarily sustain that. Especially down in the desert Southwest, you have a lot of situations where, the landscape is just, it's just desolate because every little mouthful of grass is eaten by domestic sheep and domestic cattle. On the other hand, out in that region, it takes a lot of land to be able to graze cattle, and the amount of land needed to raise and feed a herd large enough for a small ranching family to get by and even break even is so much more land than one private landowner could actually generally own themselves. You need thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of land to be able to sustain a relatively small herd. And so public lands have been the pressure release valve for this system, and in some ways have been the way to essentially subsidize ranchers for growing their cattle out on publicly owned land. So really the big picture is that maybe we need a reckoning to realize that cattle ranching is not a sustainable operation in many places where it's practiced, and it's only made sustainable at the expense of the habitat quality and biodiversity on our public lands. In other places, it's probably fine and appropriate to do. But to get more into it than that will require another hour-long presentation.
Sean, before we say thank you and goodbye to you and goodbye to all the participants, I would like to highlight that of our 4 talks that we have lined up in February, as I said, the first 2 are by Mav Kim. Then on February 18th, David Hoff is going to present a program on the black-capped chickadee. And on February 26th, one of your colleagues, Zach Coda, is going to be presenting Owls of Vermont, and Green Mountain is a co-sponsor. Sean, I think that this was one of the most informative presentations and extremely interesting ones. And I, on behalf of the Programs Committee and the Green Mountain Audubon Society, want to thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure. I feel like I've been talking. The Green Mountain Audubon community has been patiently listening to me babble about things since I was a teenager, and I really appreciate that opportunity. And I hope that you found this interesting and maybe raise some questions. So thank you again. I look forward to the next time.
Thank you all. I am now going to end the session. Good night, everybody. See you soon.